Welcome to the Design Thinker podcast, where we explore the theory and practice of design. Hosted by me, Dani, and
me, Peter.
Hey, Peter.
Hi, Dani. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you. Very well today.
We have a guest with us today.
We have a guest. Maybe people can hear the excitement in our voices. A bit different. We love our guest episodes, and I'm looking forward to this one especially.
We do. Not that I don't enjoy talking just you, Peter, but it's nice to have some guests come along.
Yeah.
So today we have a guest with us, and we'll have him introduce himself. David, did you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Yeah, why not? Nice to see you guys. I love the fact that I'm in New York and you are in Auckland, and we're having this conversation from not only thousands of miles away, but many hours away as well. You guys are actually from the future right now.
We are.
And I find that pretty exciting. Thanks for coming on here. I know our initial conversations were around talking about this sort of dumb thinking idea and framework that essentially occupies most of my waking hours. But my background, just super quickly, my background started off in music and in design. It started primarily as digital design, building digital products, but that quickly morphed into me owning these companies that I created. And so suddenly I was in this space that was very uncomfortable, where I now owned a company and I had to figure out what to do with it and where to go with it. Right. And it became a series of mistakes in my career. So it was primarily with marketing and creating products. Done everything from have clients like Nike, American Express, to creating my own content for my own channels that at one point in time had 30 million people a month that came to it and generated a nice media business out of it. But Dumbify is this thing that came out of this, as I said, I had a company that sort of came up out of nowhere and I really didn't know what I was doing. And I got to this point where I realized that the company that I had founded had gone to a place that was very unexpected, pleasantly unexpected to me. But I got into a place where it really needed to grow and it needed to morph and it needed to do things that I was really not capable of doing. And I was having dinner with a friend of mine. We're in very similar situations. Another friend of mine, Adi, who had started another company. And we were both just almost like super depressed that night because we're like, man, when we started, it was just so much fun. And right, we were able to grow. And right, and here we were in this weird mezzanine level and we weren't quite sure what to do. We thought we were acting smarter. We were trying to get more clever and really rubbing up against the defects of being too smart for your own good or trying to be too clever. And then Adi said something that just made me laugh. And he said, David, you will never meet an idiot who isn't having a good time. And that just made me laugh because it felt really true. But there was something deeper in it for me because that night, I'm a nerd at heart. So that night, I'm like, it wouldn't let me go. It's kind of like a little earworm, right? That something about that was very true. And I didn't know why or if it could be insightful for me. So I made this quant chart for myself, this sort of quad chart of dumb to smart, right? Essentially were the XY axes. And I ended up filling up sort of these buckets with archetypes. It makes sense to me what this thing might be. So if you look in like the dumb and dumb category, right, like that square that encompasses that, I put in a character like Forrest Gump, who is this character who knows they're dumb, right, not very bright, obviously manages to do some pretty interesting things in his life, obviously as a fictional character. Sliding to the right, when you had a box that is somebody who's actually dumb but thinks they're smart. So that to me was easy one. That was Homer Simpson. So that's what a perfect sort of character for that. But then as you got into the smart right part of the chart, you had this character that is who's actually really smart but uses dumb as a weapon. And when I was a kid, there was a character called Columbo. I don't know if you're familiar with his character at all. But he was always like, he would always play the fool, right? He'd walk into any room. He'd be this sort of bumbling idiot. And usually the villain, right, the criminal would it'd get them to monologue, right, about their crime. And he'd catch the criminal that way. It's a great character. But then finally in the other part of the chart was who is smart, knows they're smart, is exponentially smart. And to me, that became Spock. So I put Spock in there. And then as I'm looking at this thing, so I've got Forrest Gump, Homer Simpson, Columbo, and Spock. And it just dawns on me like instantly, oh my God, like the only thing I should learn from this that's insightful to me is don't be the miserable bastard in the upper right, Spock. That guy is never happy, like just never happy. Okay, great. Don't be that guy. try and be everybody else. And so to me, that sort of started this notion of there's something interesting in the idea of dumb thinking. And that's what put me in the position of growing this company to begin with. But somehow I had lost sight of that beginner's mind, right, kind of flavor. And I thought there were probably a lot more practices that I could develop for myself, ways to think about that could be beneficial for me. Some of it became me trying to collect as many stories as possible for where dumb ideas have actually worked, right, have solved really large problems. And others had been, how can I cherry pick all these things that I think are in this dumb thinking territory that might be a useful framework or methodology, or at least a state of mind to try and get yourself into. So to me, Dumbify just became this way to practice unconventional, counterintuitive thinking, but in a very, like, it's on purpose, right, essentially. And so that's why I initially started it, and then just started writing down the ideas that I had that had worked for me, and started to share those with people around me. I initially gave this talk at the Art Directors Club in New York, gosh, about a decade now ago. And to my surprise, it actually really resonated. And I thought they were going to think that's a dumb idea. It's a dumb thing you just said. But so that just set me on the path to keep developing it. And so here we are chatting.
Amazing. Great story. And shows the power of a 2x2. We talk about 2x2s occasionally, don't we, Dani? So Forrest, Homer, Spock, and then Columbo. I do remember Columbo. It might have been the reruns on British television.
Well, they were in reruns by the time I was a kid as well. They're quite old, those episodes, but such a
great character in his raincoat, very unassuming, under the radar, and would wrap it all up. Love it.
I'm feeling a little behind. I'm Googling who Columbo was.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, you're a bit younger.
Yeah, exactly. I need to find a much better example that fits that archetype. That's not that.
There's a little task for our listeners and your subscribers and us. A little seed to plant in our brains. Have you Googled Columbo there, Dani? Are you now up to speed with us or back in time with us?
Yeah, I'm with you, and I've bookmarked some YouTube so I can actually go watch it later.
Yeah,
fantastic.
And I think using some of those fictional characters as archetypes, I think I think it's smart. We don't take that as an offensive comment there.
Right. Now I'm offended.
That's smart. Don't do that again. No, that's smart thinking to everyone. Most people can associate with those fictional characters. It's not they're not polarizing in any way. Love it. You've gone about pulling these stories together over the last 10 years. And yeah, what's Dumbify now then, David? Tell us, bring us right up to the present day.
Up to speed?
Yeah.
So where it's at now, this was after a conversation with my daughter, who was a teenager. And what she said, it's weird the way that you think, first of all, because I'm a weird dad and I will fully cop to that. But she said, what's interesting to me about the way that you think about things is that I'm young and I'm a female. And so I feel like whenever I walk into a room and offer a suggestion or an idea, I am immediately put in that dumb category. She says, but what's interesting is that I actually get more confidence by knowing that there have been a lot of people that have been seen as being dumb throughout history. And that's sometimes just the path that you take to get ideas out. I find that to be, I think I get confidence from that. I thought, oh, sweetie, that's amazing. I love, who doesn't love hearing that? But it dawned on me that I should probably not just let this be a talk I would give from time to various people, but maybe I should start organizing in a way that might be helpful and useful. So I started a newsletter called Dumbify, and I also have written a book that comes out in the summer. And the book is it's a very in-depth version of Dumbify and the methods and the practices and the stories. And the newsletter, it's on a weekly basis. What's a little nugget, right, of dumb, if you will, in the Dumbiverse that you could learn. It's a very practical guide to getting smarter by actually getting dumber and thinking dumber. And so that's been my biggest occupation. Has been in writing that, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, and when you reached out to us and we started emailing, I immediately subscribed to Dumbify, and I really enjoy your weekly musings. And there's some amazing kind of brain sparkers, and maybe we'll come on to this later, but I love the way that you finish off your newsletter with a try this at home, take action on it, call to action. I don't mind admitting that sometimes it's really difficult. And maybe that shows that how conditioned we are to trying to be smart, not seeing things that are, or just taking things for granted. And maybe this is usually in our conversations, David, is we talk about what it is, and you've defined Dumbify and the story of it beautifully for us. And then Dani, you might correct me, but we move on to how we actually might use some of this. Is that the order, Dani, or do we talk about why it's important? You can keep us
We
on track.
usually talk about why it's important first.
Jump to there's a little teaser for later. David, why is I have a daughter myself. She's 7. I think you've just highlighted something that is incredibly important about Dumbify, is that it broadens the perspective of acceptable ideas. And if it's giving one person confidence to express their ideas, then it must therefore be giving thousands of people. But why else have you found that this concept of Dumbify over the decade and the framework and the choice to be deliberate and unconventional about your thinking, why else have you found that to be important? What difference have you seen it starting to make with you and beyond?
I think the biggest difference that I've seen in myself is that it's opened the aperture to just the possibilities in general. So before, I was really looking at ideas that I felt were smart. And it was funny because when I was chatting with others, friends of mine who were like investors, venture capitalists, they're oddly enough, venture capitalists tend to be, or at least the good ones, tend to have a dumb thinking sort of head already. And they will very quickly tell you that the ideas that come to them that are dumb and the ideas that come to them that are smart are very much at parity as to which will actually succeed. So they're actually sort of preconditioned to look for that really dumb idea that they don't quite understand. I liken it to if you're like a sports person, you've gotten injured, but you're going to go to a massage therapist, it's just going to find that knot and really get that out. There's that point at which it becomes uncomfortable because they find that spot and you're like, oh God, don't do that. But the only way through it is just so you have to lean into that discomfort, if you will. And you set it up before. I was chatting about the challenges that I give at the end of trying to actually do some of these things yourself. They're more challenging than you would think because we're just so preconditioned. We have such a bias against dumb. We don't want to look foolish. We don't want to sound foolish. And yet when we do, we open up the possibilities of solution sets, right, that are available to us. So I think it's important on a few different levels. One is to understand that there's a whole territory that you might be missing out on. That's one. And then the other is if you take the time, right, to apply yourself in it, you're going to find it's incredibly uncomfortable because it's bizarre how much we are preconditioned by that. Your parents want you to be smart. Your teachers want you. Everything in your life has been be smart. There's nothing in your world that really rewards dumb, right? And so trying to get you in that mindset, but to stay there longer. That I think is the first thing is like, how can you just train your mind to stay there longer? Because then you'll actually find these solution sets are actually there. You don't dismiss them out of hand. So if it's a business or a company, think about a company that is very much like a best practices kind of company. Like those types of companies struggle to stand out as an idea. And so you could take a company like that and say, okay, this is what you've done, really created this best practice company, but so has everybody else. So how do you actually stand out? And so taking them in this territory, it's going to make them feel uncomfortable, but at least they're going to open the aperture a ton where they might be able to find some value for themselves, differentiate outside of that. If you're like just trying to solve a problem, sometimes we've all had this where you're trying to solve it. You're just whacking your head up against the wall because, it's not working. And yet there's so much invested time that you've had in one direction, it never dawns on you to go the other direction. And so that's a big one. And if you do that, how can you feel comfortable in doing that? And then what are some things to try that actually might be useful for you? And then the other is just for individuals. If you are a creator of any kind, you're constantly self-censoring yourself. And so how can you at least keep your mind open enough for yourself to play in this territory longer than you tend to? It's like we've all seen those really dumb ideas that have become really amazing. And I'm sure we'll have this conversation. We'll come up with a dumb idea. Most people just kind of leave it there. So, that was funny. That was fun. But there are other people who they'll have agency and they'll go, wait a minute, I'm going to take that a step further and let's prototype that. Let's take that from thought to thing and get that out in the world and see what happens. And that's what I'm driving at is it's okay to get there and to do that. And it might be helpful.
Nice. So many good nuggets in there that we want to unpack. One, I want to go back to the point that you made, David, around we're so conditioned to be smart. That's also something that came up in my research, except in my research, people were talking about it we're conditioned to have the right answer. And from the time we're in school and we get called up to the front of the classroom, you did not want to be the person that had the wrong answer. So from that moment, we're conditioned that being right makes us good people, almost like we think being wrong makes us bad people. And this is what came up in the research. And what I am finding is that now, in the context of our world at the moment, we are dealing with some big, complicated challenges, and right answers don't exist anymore. There's good enough answers, or there's solutions that make things better, but there's not this one ultimate answer that we're all seeking, but we still tend to think that way.
Yeah. And we tend to think in silver bullets rather than in process as well. So if I have one idea, it might not solve everything, but it at least makes something better for the next step to then. So I always see that almost everyone wants to have an answer rather than they want to have an outcome. They're more interested in feeling right than they are in outcomes. And I feel like every discourse that we have now around the world seems to be pointing us in that direction. And so trying to get out of that. It was funny, Dani, what you just mentioned, by the way, it reminded me of with my kids when they were little, the school went to a museum. They went to the Wadsworth Museum, which is out in Hartford, Connecticut. And they have a wonderful like Saul Lewitt and Andy Warhol. They have a really great contemporary collection out there. And Alexander Calder with, remember, the mobiles and stuff. But there was one kid that my daughter was just great friends with, but he was the oddball in the group, right? He was the outsider of this whole class. And I loved him to death because as we're walking through with the docent, we would go underneath this Alexander Calder mobile, and she was explaining, she's like, this thing is going to spin around and it's going to move and it will never be in the same place twice. And Ned was just one of those kids. He was very smart at a very young age. And statistically, that's not accurate. And he was about to talk about what he meant by that. And the teachers, oh, Ned, don't. They're just like he was being a disturbance. But then my favorite was we went to the Impressionist room. And here's this beautiful Impressionist painting. There are these people from in Venice, and they're on the boats, and they're in fancy attire. And the docent says, I want you to take these pencils and these note cards, and I want you to pretend like you're people on this boat, and you're writing back to people at home, telling them about your experience. And so everybody did exactly what you would think to do. Oh, it's so lovely here in Venice, right? And I love the water, and right, blah, blah, blah. And then Ned, his thing was like, help. I'm trapped in a painting at the Wadsworth Museum. I instantly fell in love with that kid. I was like, kid, man. Yeah. He is going to have some truly interesting, original ideas. And again, he was seen as a troublemaker in that. So again, like there was some really interest. Like I just get so curious around people like that, just in general. Yeah. And I felt bad for him that he was never really going to get from school the type of curiosity that he probably would need to develop that.
Yeah. That's a great story. It's a perfect example of the unintentional kind of consequences of schools and the schooling system. And yeah, I love it. Stuck in the painting.
I think schools where creativity goes to die.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Did you guys ever experience Montessori? I did Montessori when I was really young.
You did.
And I loved that. Man, there's something, I feel like I never really hear about that much anymore. It was almost like an experiment. I went to school in the 70s and 80s when I was little, and it was still very an echo of the hippie generation. I'd have a teacher who would sing Puff the Magic Dragon in a sort of our Montessori kind of vibe. But I always found that to be pretty interesting because you could, whatever you were curious in was where you went, right? And you applied your learning in that way.
I'm a Montessori child, and a quick side story. It's actually what changed my life in a lot of ways. I'm left-handed, and I really struggled with writing as a child. And they were doing all these tests because they were worried I had some sort of brain malfunction. Yeah. And one of my Montessori teachers said, what if we just let her write on blank pieces of paper? And so to this day, I buy my notebooks in blank sheets of paper because when I write on blank sheets of paper, I could just write. Whereas when I'm forced to write on lines, and I think that is the Montessori experience, that they cater to the child and figure out how do we help this child thrive rather than how do we fit this child into a box.
Totally. My mother, by the way, is the same. She actually is ambidextrous. And when she was a child, they thought the same thing, but it turned out that she was actually left-handed. But back then, they actually would beat that out of you. She actually got wrapped on the hands, right, for writing left-handed. But she has a great, if you ask her to do this, my kids love asking grandma to write a sentence in both hands at the same time. She
Oh,
actually
wow.
does. It's really fun. And then she'll try and write two different things at the same time, which she can, but not incredibly well, but it's still fun to watch.
That
Well,
is
I'd love to
cool.
see that. That's a great trick. Yeah, Montessori, actually, we talked about being in New Zealand. Montessori is alive and kicking probably around the world, but definitely in New Zealand. And
Nice.
my daughter doesn't go to Montessori school, but we looked into Montessori and set the house up when she was a little toddler. And I think one of the basic tenets, which maybe kind of reflects on a little bit of Dumbify, but essentially, normal school systems. And I've got a copy of the Robinson Manifesto on my wall, where Ken Robinson years ago talked about this very subject, in that they're set up for a kind of industrial age when schools needed to produce human beings that were ready to go and do work in the workforce. And it was like a pushing information into people's brains versus, I think, one of the principles of Montessori is you arrange information in the form of words, pictures, objects, etc., lessons, and they're available for the humans, even if they're tiny, to draw and pull things rather than be pushed information. They're pulling information in the way that they like and prefer, and their brains are already starting to tune into. And maybe that's an example of, maybe not, David, you can tell me, but a flipping around. Essentially, Dumbify is it's like taking something that's mainstream and normal and accepted, and just sometimes just doing the complete opposite and seeing what happens. And yeah, Montessori has obviously done that to great benefit, as we can see from Dani.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you had that experience. I wished I would have kept on with it. Our school system did it as a test for a number of years and then turned it off for some reason.
Yeah.
But the opposite thing is pretty funny because there are two things that I've just always done that become this is part of the mental model for me is in opposites. There's sort of two different things that I do. But one is, do you remember the show Seinfeld?
Yep.
So there's an episode where
Hold on. Wait a minute, David.
Yes,
Dani?
I do.
Oh, no.
You do?
Are you the biggest Seinfeld person ever?
I loved Seinfeld. Granted, I watched it on rerun, but I think it's one of the best shows. So for me, Friends and Seinfeld and Big Bang Theory are up there.
Yeah, that, and I'd have to have a Rick and Morty is now on there for me as well, which I always find fascinating. That's part of my over. There's just their life lessons in nihilism from Rick and Morty that I find fascinating. But there's this episode in Seinfeld where George Costanza decides that he is going to do the exact opposite just for one day. Anything that would be his instinct, he's going to do exactly the opposite. And he ends up having just like the best day of his life in doing that. He just realized that all of his instincts essentially were wrong. And so I called this for myself. I call it the George Costanza method. And it was really just a way to say, okay, when I'm really knocking my head up against the wall, clearly like the direction I'm going in is not right. And yet, which direction should I go? The immediate direction I could go is the opposite, right? And so I think about what that is. That developed into, there was another guy that just gave me a morsel that I just loved. And he said, he was asking, if large is the opposite of small, then what's the opposite of medium? And I thought that was hilarious for obvious reasons, because it just gets you thinking, right?
Yeah.
So where the George Costanza is essentially, one direction I could go would be to go opposite, right? Another direction that I could go is I could actually go what I would call like this middle thinking realm, which is really, if I were to take two opposing ideas, like a Venn diagram, right? So if I took A and B and I smashed them together, most people look at the middle as like a weird, like a compromise, maybe like a dumbing down of those two things. But often what you find when you smash them together is the thing that's in the middle is a new thing, right? There's something brand new, right, that comes out of it. And so that's also another direction, right, that you could go. So if I'm going this way, and if I go this way, right, and if I were to smash them together, what comes out, right, as a result. So those are other just like little tricks of things. I actually started training some little AI agents just to see if they would synthesize stuff as well. That's been pretty fascinating. My favorite was I asked it to, I just did a little just prompt so that it would, what the instruction set was. I said, take two opposing ideas, make them up. Like, what are two opposites, and put them together. My favorite was it took cooperation and competition and it smashed them together, and it synthesized this word and it came up with co-opetition. And I thought, well, that's a wonderful word. What a great word, co-opetition. Something like that. And then it rationalized that co-opetition is a couple of different things. One, it could be like when Crocs and Balenciaga decide to merge and make that shoe, right? That crazy high heel Croc shoe.
Yeah.
Or it could be as simple as logistics. You're an airport and you're competing airlines, but you are the hub that you have is in support of each other and all the logistics right around it. Or like a Japanese karetsu, where you're able to have businesses that have shared resources. So I thought that was fascinating. So even as just like a simple tool to synthesize new ideas, that was a good one. But the opposite one I always think is great, because that'll sometimes lead you to, I call it the make it worse method, where it's if you're trying to make something, right, you just like, how do I make it the worst thing that it could possibly be? For like design thinking, I know that's part of the thing. So it's like you can sometimes find the imperfections or the flaws or the things that you actually need to fix in that. And then what I find, the way I think about where dumb thinking applies with that type of method is if you let it, you'll actually create brand new things right from it. So you're not necessarily trying to find the flaws or the hidden things that you need to fix. It's really that you've created something new. As an example, have you guys ever heard the story of how the potato chip was invented? Because this always trips me out. It was a chef, and he had a customer, hated his French fries, everything about him. And so every time he'd come in, the chef would be like, today's the day I'm going to make my French fries better, and this guy's going to love my French fries. And every time, it's like a big zero. Nope, hate your French fries. So this went on for a while. And so until he finally got so frustrated, he's, damn it, I'm done with trying to make these French fries better. I'm going to make the worst French fry imaginable. So he cuts them really thin, he burns them, he salts the hell out of them. And all of a sudden, everybody loves them, right? Because they're not eating French fries. He's just invented the potato chip. And I thought that was so funny. So if you try and make the worst case of something, sometimes if you, again, just take the time to marinate in it, just keep going with it. Sometimes you find like some new output from that.
You're touching on this idea of play in problem solving. One of the reasons we're not better problem solvers is that we tend to think about problem solving as serious work, and it's got to be spreadsheets and calculations. And to some degree, if you're building a building, by all means, use some calculations. But for most of our work, like we don't have that fun element. And because we don't have that fun element, our creativity just is dying. But when you introduce just that little bit of fun, it gets the brain sparks going, and that's where the potato chip idea comes in. I use this method a lot in my work, particularly when teams are stuck and they're not getting anywhere, saying, let's figure out how to make this even worse. If we're going to be bad at something, let's go all out and be super bad at it and see what happens. And that just gets the spot going. There's excitement, there's play. So how can we introduce more play into our work?
Yeah, play is one of those really interesting things because it always sounds like it should be so easy. And usually people just won't do it. To your point, when people are trying to solve problems, we tend to think that the problem solution is probably more complex. And so we really start diving into complexity, and we really start to get away right from play. But the instant that somebody in that group like just tries to wake up the group to go the other way, sometimes they can be successful, but it really depends on if the culture was set up where they actually are there to receive it, essentially. And I think it's one thing as an individual, like how can you get yourself into that state of play? I think we all have different resources and ways potentially to do that for ourselves. But when you're in a social setting, in a group or at work, there are just so many different factors involved there. And so for me, for play, it's not just like, how do I get that individual's mindset to go there? But how do you get the culture of the place to understand that play is actually the requirement to do the best possible work that you can, and that to dismiss that as a part of the process means you're likely to get a more mediocre or mundane project, right? Potentially. So if I can work with you there to let you know that this is a very important part of the process, and then try and figure out, okay, who are the people when you're in a group? You guys know this, like there's always the loud person and it's always getting all the attention. There's usually the introverts who won't, they've got great ideas, but they're not going to say anything. The group dynamic starts to take over essentially. Or maybe there's a boss who thinks they're being hip and cool, kind of, what's his name? Brent from The Office, the English version, right? Where you're just like, oh God, this guy. And but you're trying to get them to essentially understand. And one thing that I've been happy to see culturally over the last 10 years, if not more now, I think startup culture has, which can be terrible, don't get me wrong, but there's like this fail culture that started to emerge, which is it's okay. Not only is it okay to fail, but they can actually reward failure. The quicker you can get to it, the better. And it's been reframed as knowledge, right? As information rather than failure. And so if you can get companies who don't quite understand that mentality, getting them there is pretty important. And then once they get there, play just becomes much easier because then there's like an accountability in the group that we know that this is like part of the gig, right? And not only is it the fun part of the gig, but this is the one where we can really let it go. Yeah. And once that culture is set up, play is no longer a problem.
It's so much it resonates with my experience and my beliefs. Absolutely.
I'm sure you guys have worked with many companies where it's, my God, like you just got to find a way to get the culture to just accept this so that they can get what they need out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things, going back to what you were saying there, David, one of them is sometimes it does only take one person just to be a little bit different and to be the playful one. It always reminds me of a little bit like the court jester. In medieval times, that was their job to be that person to basically deliver a serious message in a playful, humorous way. So that archetype always comes to mind.
I'm actually the newsletter that comes out tomorrow is actually about the fool. Actually,
really?
Yeah, we're channeling each other right now.
Wow! And now the next thought that's associated that I remembered is the Joker in the deck of cards. There's actually kind of the story behind the Joker in the deck of cards goes way further back than medieval times, where we had the actual court jester. There's kind of deep and interesting meaning behind the Joker and mysticism. It would be a better story if I could remember what it was. But there's
that also comes out in tarot cards, right? So there's the tarot card fool. This was pointed out to me by someone I was having a conversation with. Oh man, you're right. And what's interesting about when you get the Fool tarot card, it doesn't mean that you're dumb or you're the fool or you're an idiot. It means like infinite possibilities, right?
Yeah.
There's, oh man, that's so good. All throughout, at least Western culture, there's like this avatar that's about infinite possibilities. And that resonated with me mostly because if you're only looking in smart territory and not mining any dumb territory, the possibilities have now been almost cut in half. Yeah. And so the Fool is really there to point you in that direction. Yeah. And I think ours is always funny because I think we actually see the gesture as like somebody whose head gets cut off during some kind of uprising or something. Yeah, that's just the Hollywood version of that. But I think it goes back to being an esoteric character for like real kind of outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. It must have been the good ones. Maybe the good ones were able to survive because, again, they could avoid conflict with humor, I suppose, is where I'm trying to get to there.
Yeah, totally. Like we see that with the Jon Stewarts of the world, or even I don't know. Are you guys? There was an old play that was turned into a movie called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard that one. And essentially taking like the two funny characters inside of the Shakespeare play, right, in Hamlet, and rather than showing you the Shakespeare play, it's just these two characters when they're not on stage, essentially. And they're having like these really like super existential conversations, and they're solving all sorts of problems, but they're just two idiots. Right. Essentially not realizing that they're solving this problem. It's kind of like Waiting for Godot kind of style. It's super, super interesting. But that's the last time I think I've actually seen like the jester played in like a positive light. But Jon Stewart's probably one of the best of those I could think of very recently. He's so good at that.
I love it. Oh, I've heard of Rosencrantz, and so have I got them?
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is the name of. They made it to a movie, and it's really great. It's Tom Hulce, is that his name? And, oh God, why am I misplacing? The guy who played Sid Vicious, the guy who was also in was it Slow Horses?
Right? Gary Oldman.
Thank you. Yeah, it's Gary Oldman. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, there's two reasons to go and watch. I've heard about it, never realised what it was about, but that's near the top of my movie list now. And then the other thing I was going to go back to, was just this idea and kind of connection with both of you on. It's an interesting situation where you're working with a group and kind of understandably that they're struggling to step out of their kind of day-to-day thinking, working, and come up with new ideas to solve a problem that they often don't even see because they're so close to it. But as soon as you ask them ways to make something worse, then all of a sudden the ideas start to flow, and then the simple kind of turnaround for those is, okay, now all of those ideas, just turn them into positives, and there's your new ideas. It's always fascinating and never fails to amaze me how powerful that technique is. And I think it just shows, the power of Dumbify, in that we are just trained to not see things. And also there's something in the ability to negative brainstorm, that we are not just not seeing things, but we're quite negative in our thinking, or society trains us to look at things in a negative way. And I think that's why those negative ideas come to people so easily.
Yeah, it's like a filter set. It's like whenever you've opened up a new app and they've got new filters that you've never seen, you're like, oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, how can you get people to interchange some filters that might not be working for them and try some new ones, right? See what works. I know for me, like design thinking was always a pretty interesting framework. I always liked how that works. I think where Dumbify actually became more of like an extension of some of the aspects of design thinking, where what would frustrate me sometimes about design thinking was it always worked really well for me when I was looking to optimize, when I was really looking to make something better. It's so good at that.
Yeah.
But when it came time to generating like net new ideas, so a company's, hey, we have this one thing, but we need to reframe this one thing in order to open up new markets. What's the thing? What's the market? All that stuff. And design thinking didn't really, it tries because it has aspects of it, but you don't spend enough time in the area to ruminate in dumb enough, right? To get breakthrough ideas when they're needed. There was an offshoot of that. It's kind of like, great. Once we get to this reverse brainstorming, right, kind of place, what are other things that we could do? How could we spend more time here? And then see what comes out of that.
When I was reading about your work, this is an area that in my practice I also struggle with, because it feels like when we get to ideation, that's the part that every organization just wants it done and quick and over with. And I feel like the whole concept of Dumbify is like ideation, that if you hone into the ideation part of design thinking and then you like jack it up with some steroids, that to me was the image I got of, it's like ideation on steroids. And it's such a needed thing, because this whole idea of slowing down to explore ideas, it's not something that comes naturally to organizations, because everything is about quick, fast delivery, get it done. What are we going to get done this quarter? What are we going to get? And again, having deadlines and timelines are important.
Super real. Yeah.
Also slowing down to make sure that we're working on the right things, that we've identified something meaningful to do that's going to solve a problem. We don't take enough time up front. So like my mantra that I think everybody's tired of me saying is, you've got to go slow to go fast. And what your work is doing is highlighting and giving a way of how do we slow down, and so that we can go fast later.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects that are right on. One is by taking the time to go into this area a little bit longer. One thing that will happen is that culturally over time, because you're so used to it, like your muscle memory gets better. You're just more fit, right, in that area. So every time you come back to it, it's just better. It's easier to flex. You can run faster. You can push more weight. So that part's, you just got to work at it like everything else, right, to get great at it. The other thing that I always found fascinating, though, was that when you keep doing the same thing over and over again that's not working, you just end up wasting so much more time, because you really haven't. You just got to stop, take a beat, right? Sometimes you just got to take it back to the studs and build it again. Other ways, you just got to look for what are techniques that I could do that can bring this back. I will actually end up saving time, because we actually have found a breakthrough rather than just constantly. I might have come up with ideas that we can test really quickly, but they might be really terrible because they're the same idea over and over again.
You're talking our language, David.
We've all experienced that one. I know it. Yeah.
And the saving time thing. I was going to ask David about this idea of staying longer, and what have you discovered yourself, and what kind of lessons can you teach us about staying individually and maybe as groups in this space for longer? What does it take? How do we do that?
I think one is to recognize when there's discomfort in it. So that's usually the first sign, because you'll automatically want to do it. And then the first thing that will happen is you'll say, oh, that's the dumbest idea. I don't see how this would possibly be helpful. This is just taking me so far away from my solution. There's just going to be all of that. So the first step is to block that out, right, to the extent that you can. And that's why I say just spend more time in it, right? And don't dismiss it right away. Sometimes it takes people like, great, the first time, let's just get all the ideas down. Let's have no judgment about them. Design thinking does this really well. Let's get them all out, right? But rather than the next step is great. Now let's like filter them right away. Don't filter them right away, right? Filter them tomorrow. Let yourself marinate in those dumb ideas, because they will have had time to have that. They'll morph, they'll change, they'll become more robust by the time you get to it. So that's I would highly recommend that. And then the other is the peer group thing that we were talking about before, right? That one is pretty damn important to get there. So it's not that you just individually, right, will notice the discomfort, but you need to have a leader that kind of makes that okay and to recognize in everybody. So imagine coming out with a really dumb idea and you'll filter yourself right away. Oh, that's a stupid thing I could, right? And you'll have that, right? But you need to have that leader and say, nope, you know what? That is not. And then if that leader can impromptu in ways to spin off on that. So like the famous yes and, right? It's kind of like, oh, I hear what you're saying. And what if you also did this, right? And it just starts to get, and then the idea starts to develop rather than dies, right? There.
One of the things we fail to remember, we've all seen this light bulb moment, and it's created this impression that ideas come out of our heads fully formed and perfect and ready to go. And ideas are not that way. They're very delicate, and they need some nurturing and some pampering and some development. They're almost like little babies. You don't just pop them out and there you go to work now. There's a lot that you do to nurture them.
Sometimes you think your baby's really ugly as well. And you're like, oh, I just had a really ugly baby. And you don't recognize it. Wait, this is a beautiful child. This is going to grow up to be amazing. I think a lot of people just have a hard time evaluating dumb ideas as well. And that's tricky. I think that's really tricky. I think one of the ways to get over that quickly is to put agency behind it quickly. So once you've decided that, cool, we like all these dumb ideas. And if you can task yourself with, let's really try the dumb ones, right? Too. Let's take half the one that the groups are like, oh, we like these ideas. And then the ones that get filtered out as being too dumb, let's bring those in. Let's get to the prototyping phase really quickly. Let's get some duct tape, some paper, some card, whatever it's going to take, right, to like prototype. Just get it out there. Go from thought to thing very quickly, and then let people react to it. And then you start to see very quickly what's working and what's not. You get some real feedback, right? There's a real feedback system on it rather than just you freaking out of it being a good or a bad idea.
Yeah. From thought to thing. Yes, a new phrase. I'm going to store that away. Thank you, David.
Oh, that's fun. We always use that one all the time. I think that's just one that we'd always use those in strategy sessions because most of my business has been building brands and trying to find new markets or building companies. And it's how do you get from thought to thing very quickly so that you can see if it's wrong or not. And then how can you go back to the drawing board, essentially?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. People have a hard time just even getting to that stage, and they feel like, oh, it's a good idea, therefore it will win. It's going to be amazing, right? Yeah. And then they decide that it's not, and they're, oh, I'm not doing those dumb ideas again. And there's like that forced feedback loop. Yeah. But I feel like there's real insight in the people that just this is what they do naturally. I think of like a recent company would be, are you familiar with a water company? It's Death Water. What's their brand? It's like they've turned water into what looks like a gothic beer meets energy drink, right? Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it started off as a joke, right? It started off as, wouldn't it be funny? Yeah, we could reframe water. It's like this, everybody's thinking mountain air and crispy, right, lakes and blue and right. And they're just like, no, death water. And it was just such a funny idea. But rather than it stopping there, they're like, let's design a can. Let's like put that stuff together and let's get it out there. And that's literally $1 billion company now.
Wow.
That is a massive market. And I think there's something to be learned in those people that just aren't afraid to take the thing that sounds silly in conversation and try and bring it to life. I think there's a lot of insight into how they do that.
I think the other insight there is sometimes we think that the cool idea needs to be a new idea. What's older than water to be able to take that?
Like reframing is so good. Yeah. I think design thinking was always good for reframing. I love that concept. What's something that already works really well? And then how can you completely reframe it, right, as something else? There's a group in New York, in the city, in Brooklyn. It's a company called Mischief, MSCHF. And Gabe they're a group of people that think of themselves as an art collective more than anything. But every month they will do a product drop, essentially. And it will be anything from shoes to software to, it's really crazy, the stuff that they make. as an example, one of the things that they did was taxes. Like they took something really boring, TurboTax. It's like, how could we reframe people doing their taxes rather than it feeling, oh God, I hate doing my taxes, and it just feeling so terrible. They said, what if we actually turned it into a really weird game where you're flirting with these anime characters, right? And the whole point of this game is that by the time you're done, it will have done your taxes for you. And so that is really silly, but has a very useful output, right? Doing your taxes. I think it's like Tax Heaven 3000, I think is what it's called. And but they're so good at just being able to take something and go, this exists in the universe. How can I reframe it and turn it into something else? They took holy water from somewhere religious and they inserted it into shoes and made Jesus shoes. And then they did a collaboration.
You're literally walking on water.
You're walking on water. Yeah, exactly. It's like the fashion community and the drop community are like, oh, this was like, there's a story behind this shoe. And then they quickly followed it with this one where they took blood and they actually put it, and that became like Satan's shoe. And they did that collab with Lil Nas X, and everybody was like, what? People were freaking out and became this big PR story. It's very funny. But I love the way that they think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And it's always reframing stuff.
Yeah. Cool.
So here's a question for you. There are these traditional industries that have been around forever, and innovation in those companies, and they all say they want to be innovative, but it just doesn't seem to. So do you think that there is any hope of those types of organizations becoming like
I do. I think banking is interesting because I worked a lot with American Express, and I actually was the executive creative director of that brand for Ogilvy. And they're very much a bank, right? A banking kind of company. And what I think is interesting, the way I would think about banking is, where do you actually have the opportunities to innovate? Because it's often about money, right? And people are obviously, you want people to be very serious about your money. You don't want to lose it, right? You don't want to do goofy things that will all of a sudden make that not money. That would be a terrible thing to do. But like, where can innovation actually come from first, right? So that you can do it. So the way that American Express would think about it would always be tended to be shown through its marketing, not necessarily through its advertising, but through its marketing. So they would actually try and create movements and ideas around things that were innovative. So like in the United States around Thanksgiving, they created this thing called Small Business Saturday. And it was in reaction to the great financial crisis. And so all of these small businesses all around the country were really hurting. And so they thought it would be interesting if we could try and pull together a movement with all of our small business customers, right, that take Amex, and we will provide essentially like this lift, right, to get everybody to go and shop small business rather than the big box retailers for Black Friday. Why not, right, go to these small businesses? And that was an interesting innovation because they were able to take the idea of their problem was, how do we get people to use the card on more everyday things, right? Small business is an interesting market opportunity. There's a real need state strategically for why you would want to do that. But how could you turn that into a platform that's quite unique, that feels innovative, that it's not just a one-off, but it's a new product category, essentially, for us. Mm-hmm. So I think they were able to find that marketing is a way to do that. But then also in banking, I think you've got other people outside of banking who are obviously innovating as well, which I think is interesting. So Bitcoin is one of those really weird projects where you realize you are your own bank, essentially. Like that, talk about upending, banking altogether. And then looking at what a bank actually does and why it actually does it the way that it does it, and the rails that are actually made technically, right, for that to become a thing. So sometimes from the outside, you see some of those things pop up. So to see somebody like Larry Fink, right, from BlackRock say that, hey, everything right now that works as a security can certainly be tokenized. And there's a way for us to actually build something that is quite new and quite innovative. And what you're able to do with that is just such a step change from what you could do with that, right, in the past. So at least was able, to its credit, is able to look outside of itself, right, to find new solutions. I find banking personally incredibly fascinating and super interesting because it's such a weird category, but it matters to everybody, right? So like, it's the one thing, everybody has to use money, right, for the most part. So like, where can you find innovation and where can you find things that could be improved? What a really great sort of area, right, to play in.
I too find banking fascinating, which is why I spent more than half my career in that industry. And I think what you're touching on is when we talk about things like innovation and creativity and play, we look at institutions like banking and go, that doesn't belong there. But what you're touching on is it's not a or, it's an and. Because you look at, okay, like a bank, you've got regulations, there are those things that you have to comply with. There are those things that just have to happen a certain way that needs a lot of guardrails and where innovation shouldn't be happening. But around that,
Yeah.
there are opportunities to innovate. And saying is that you have to find the areas where we can have that play and creative thinking while being mindful not to
Yeah.
lose people's money.
Yeah, exactly. I often wonder too. I wonder if there's somebody inside of a bank that there's a technique I call in design thinking. There's this technique where you're trying to put on constraints, right?
Yeah.
So you can work within the constraints to find creativity. There's another way to think about that, which is to actually do the opposite and release the constraint, right? Essentially.
Hmm.
So what's if you were to solve a problem, the first thing you might ask yourself is what's the one thing that's stopping me from doing what I want to do? And so one of it might be, oh, there's this thing. And if that just went away, my problem would be solved. So in some instances, you're like, great, okay, let's work about maybe you can't get rid of the constraint, but maybe you can loosen the constraint, right, in some way. But with compliance issues and things that are right instituted in law, like those are very challenging. But that's going to be a very slow process. But the people who could also be innovative, I think, inside of banking groups or organizations that operate like that is how do you look at the constraints that you do have and where are the places where you feel like you could actually weaken those constraints so that you can actually make that product better. Weaken's a weird word because that's automatically feels like scary, right? In a way, but it's really looking at innovation in a different way that you feel like you're in the box. There's like this fundamental way that things are just always done. But when you ask yourself the question of, wait, why is it done that way? And like,
Yeah.
how baked in is it really? And can I actually weaken that in some way? Or is there a different way to think about that where that's just not so?
Yeah. I
And
love
in
it.
banking, that takes somebody who knows that system incredibly well, obviously, to do that. Yeah.
And maybe I was going to say that banking to me is a paradox, but there's almost two paradoxes. That first one is that person who knows that system so intimately and technically, perhaps less inclined to be able to step out of it and look at it from a different perspective and start to think more dumbly, to
Yeah. It's
dumbify their
almost like
thinking about it.
that'd be like a take your 5-year-old to work day and ask,
Yeah, yeah.
what
Oh,
dumb
wow.
questions are they going to
There
ask?
you go. Maybe is that a dumbify technique, David?
It should be. Maybe we just made up a new one. We'll put that
Yeah.
we'll put it in.
But my 7-year-old, I go to a weekly yoga class for men, and it's amazing. Unfortunately, our teacher was unable to take the session last night because he was unwell. And I was telling my daughter this, and she said, "Why doesn't someone else take it? He's the teacher." But someone who's like you, who's there every week and knows how to do it, why do you take it? I was like, it's a good question. And
That's
other
a
than,
great question. That's
you
so
know,
good.
what's is it? I don't really have a good answer for that, other than I'm not a yoga teacher, but then I've done it for 50 or 100 times, so I should know it. I'm sure I could replicate. So yeah, good example. Coming back to banking, the paradox I think of banking is, and I worked at the same time as Dani, so it's only a small period of my career has been in banking, but it was fascinating how much the word risk came up, and it became just one of these kind of almost cultural memes. It came out of people's mouths before they'd even thought about it. It was just like an automatic kind of response to not being able to do something. But there were pockets of creativity. But what's really interesting about banking, and without getting too deep and philosophical, money is based on it's nothing. It's the least one of the least tangible things there is. That it's just this idea. It's a promise of somebody paying money. It's a promise from one person to another. It's nothing more than an idea, and yet
Yeah.
we've built these layers and layers of structure and process and everything, and making things less and less tangible now. But for a period there, we had gold bullion and paper money and coins. Now we're having just electrons, etc. But this it's an interesting, and maybe this is a dumb technique, David. To you, what is money? Money is nothing more than a promise, words between one person and another, ultimately. So, how might that help us to rethink the problem we're trying to solve here?
Yeah, totally. I think somewhere, whoever Satoshi Nakamoto is or was,
Hmm.
right, was looking at that same question. And I think most people have a real misperception of what money actually is. And it's so abstracted away from us that you really can't even think about what it would mean to live life without it. And so even if you go and you try and figure out what you're asking, some really dumb questions, but we're just so conditioned to feel like the thing that is always was. The reality is that just isn't. And so if you can find a different mechanism, I think Bitcoin is an interesting one because it's literally a math problem in search of ways to build what is money in a way that cannot be tampered with by the outside world. It doesn't require a governor. It doesn't require a person to come in and tamper with it. It really is its own thing. And it's a recording device, essentially. It's like a weird computer that's output creates a tradable thing. And that's super fascinating. I feel like there's so many different, think about a company like a Goldman Sachs. I guarantee inside of that company, there are a million really creative people in there trying to figure out ways to package securities and things and write brand new ways that might work in that system. Just derivatives on derivatives on derivatives. And that might be too much of a clever approach. We know that, to me, clever is always the enemy. And so sometimes I see solutions like that of they're just too clever. And when they're obfuscated in those ways, they can really blow up. But there is something very creative, I think, in that spirit of trying to think through, if you can understand, get through its abstraction, if you can get it to be more tangible for yourself. It's like having moldable clay, right? You're just like, oh, cool, I'm going to build this thing instead. Or maybe I'll abandon it altogether because I want new materials for it. That deep understanding is sometimes needed. But to your point about the expert, sometimes you just need that 5-year-old that asks the really dumb question, right? Because you're just too close of it. So it's never one thing, it's both things, right? There's like the engine of the yin and the yang. You need both in order to have a flywheel to work.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love it.
Let's see, where are we? So we've talked about what, we've talked about why, we've talked about how. So I think we've covered and David, this has been such a fantastic, I feel like I could spend all day chatting with you.
I know we could talk about this forever. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Getting the sense we're very like-minded. So this is a fun conversation. I really enjoy this. Yeah,
absolutely.
We covered a lot of ground. We could probably go for a ton of other things, but I think we've gone through a bunch of examples. We've gone through a bunch of different methodologies. One thing I was pretty curious about from you guys, because you guys are design thinking experts, to me, I kind of balanced this thing in my head where there's overlap with design thinking, but then there are places where it definitely goes in a different way than design thinking. And so I'm always in this mind of, okay, design thinking has already covered this material quite well. So what, in contrast, exactly where would you apply this and where would that be useful? Where I found it to be the most useful, like I said before, was in that area of idea generation, of being able to spend more time there and not to move on so quickly from that. That to me is the best sort of complement the way that it works in there. But there might be other areas, or that might be completely wrong, but I'd love to hear your perspective on how you think about it as a model that applies to anything that you guys are doing and how you might utilize it. And if it doesn't have to come up now, but I'm just super curious if you feel like there's something that I might be missing as well.
When you were talking about this, my mind was going to, because I've got a session coming up, I wonder, where my mind went to is, so when we do ideation, we go through a process of selecting ideas, and then there's those ideas that just aren't favorable. And one of the things that are playing in my mind is that usually then what I have the team do is prototype the popular ideas. And what if we turned that and we had them pick at least one idea that wasn't popular and prototype that? So I wonder if there's also an element of dumbifying.
I'd love to hear how that turns out.
Yeah, in that space.
Yeah.
So that's where my mind went to.
Similarly, I can picture myself in many workshops and encouraging people to not filter themselves and to be content with dumb ideas, because those are often the breakthrough ones. And eventually, when we do get to a large list or a big set of potential solutions, or at least ideas to begin with, then often the next stage is I call it concept development. So get people to let's say, just take 3 random ideas and join them together and see what those are. maybe see what is the dumbest idea you can come up with out of all the ideas in front of you. Take as many as you want, combine them together into something that just is the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen, or maybe more. Again, when I get people to choose which ideas to go forwards to start building prototypes, again, a technique I use is, so what's the most likely to succeed? What's like the easiest, most obvious idea? Choose one of those. Choose another one that you think is going to be most, and this is borrowed from the Stanford D School. Choose something that's going to, you for sure is going to delight the person who's going to use it. It might not be the easiest to build or implement, but it's going to delight them. And then the third one is choose something that's going to be the most breakthrough. But maybe an alternative to breakthrough is actually choose the dumbest, or choose the least likely to succeed. Choose one that you think is just not going to work at all, and then see what happens. And because I really love your kind of invitation, David, and your premise that actually the longer we stay in this space, the more likely we're going to get something from it. We'll get an outcome from it if we
I like that.
slow
I'd
down
love
and
to know how
pay
that.
attention.
I thought there were two really interesting ideas in there. One was that lateral thinking kind of device, right, where you're essentially like connecting. I'd be really interested to be able to take the dumb ideas that are out there and try and find those connections and see when pulled together if there's a solution there. And then the other might be if you spend more time in the ideas that you initially thought were just too dumb to actually work, ask yourself, is it delusional? And if it's not delusional, and by that, there's just no possible way that you could actually do it. It's one thing to say that I believe I could fly, and I think I can do that by jumping off my house. It's another to say I think I could fly because I have built myself some wings, and look like two totally different things, right? Forcing yourself to really apply a dumb idea to see where your mind will take it is also an interesting way to go. It forces you to think in ways that you might be uncomfortable with, but you'll also have solutions that are just potentially new.
One more thing I'll add, it's kind of in the idea generation space, but it often, like we talked about it earlier, getting people to come up with ideas full stop is challenging sometimes because they're not in that mode of thinking in their day-to-day usually, but priming can help. So again, jumping off your roof without any wings, not a good idea. Jumping off your roof with a set of wings could be a good idea, but to come up with the idea of the wings in the first place, how about you read the story or are told the story of someone who's done it before you? So I think what and I thank you for this, David, you started to create and bring together all these stories that create a rich set of possibilities for people. They can see them already. So if you are less inclined to imagine the future, you can look to the past and go, someone's done this already. And for people like Dani and I, who are helping people step into that ideation frame of mind, then a few stories up front to give an example of here's a dumb idea that actually seemed that it was going nowhere, it was really unpopular, but it's turned into $1 billion business, for example. To our banking colleagues who are more linear in thinking, then there's the evidence that this will be a good idea to spend some time in.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting in the comfort that you get from knowing that others have done it, or at least having some sort of priming story helps.
Yeah.
I know for me, what I've used in the past sometimes that helps is you're essentially creating like a failure journal. I'll do that for myself. And I'm always amazed when you go back and look, and I was like, oh, that was a really dumb idea. And you'll laugh. And then other times you're like, the time has changed. The context has changed. That's maybe not so dumb anymore. It starts to have value, right, temporally in a different way. But then there's also a way to reward that. So in a session, you're obviously going to reward like the dumbest ideas, right, essentially, because it's kind of just like a prize, right, for these things were just so silly, but we love that you went there. Just being able to reward people for failing just so spectacularly. It was also a nice way to get people to give it their all and don't feel silly. Feel anxious about that.
I love that. The other place that I feel like this would be really useful is, so in design thinking, we do what's called discovery work or empathy work, where we're exploring and talking to people to understand what the problem is, identify needs, wants, and pain points. I wonder if there's an opportunity to use the concept of Dumbify. What is the dumbest question I can ask in this? And that's trying to tap into that 5-year-old's curiosity. Because one of the things that I notice happening is when we're thinking about doing the empathy work, everybody's trying to come across as smart and ask the smart questions. So if we flip that, let's ask the stupid question. So that's another area that I think the concept of Dumbify could fit into.
I love it. That's exactly the right place to put that in, is that empathy research section. There is a story that I think maybe operates well for that to prime, which is there was a study that was done in Japan. It was in a university, which I can never pronounce very well. They were looking at specifically alertness after sleep, essentially. And so the leader of this experiment was great enough to recognize that the experiments that they were going to do it was obviously going to be a very scientific experiment, but the types of things that they could actually put into this experiment, he opens up to the group. What should we be testing? And one of the students said, we should test ice cream. And everybody's kind of laughs, right? And it's silly. Oh, so when you wake up in the morning, you're going to have ice cream for breakfast, right? And that actually ended up being one of the very positive things that came out of the study that they were doing. So they found that not only did it actually get you alert for obvious reasons, sugar, come on, but apparently it put you in this brain state that also made you very calm, but very alert at the same time. That, there's something, who would have known? And that actually became the most interesting thing about that study. But it's because they asked for what would be like some really silly things to test here.
Yeah. Clever.
I love that story.
Yeah.
I love that.
Me too.
Now you want
I love the idea of maybe this is a good place just to start to wrap up, because Richard Feynman, the famous American scientist, one of his methods that's attributed to him is 5-year-old method, where you, to understand something yourself, try and teach it to a 5-year-old, and if you can't, you don't understand it well enough because you haven't simplified everything. Yep. Whereas what we are saying is actually ask the question that the 5-year-old would ask. Be the 5-year-old. Yeah, don't be the professor. Be the 5-year-old. That's right.
There's another version of that I like, which is explain it as if you're explaining to an alien, right? Somebody who really has no context at all. Because that really becomes a little more challenging. Or to look at it as if you're the alien. It's like you're trying to take context completely away from, because then you start asking really interesting why questions. You're just way more curious because you have zero context.
Yeah. I love it.
The other one someone told me, and I'll just throw this in the bucket. Explain it like you would try to explain to your grandma how to use an iPhone.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that so much. Just having experienced that deeply, I totally get that. We had a funny thing that I don't know if we're going to do it or not, but it was essentially having kids teaching older people lots of things, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the way that it initially took off was around gaming. And it was like, if you're going to create a university, but it was going to be a university not for young people, but for old people, what might they want to learn that might be interesting? And so one thought was around gaming. So the instant that like somebody who's retired tries to get into Call of Duty is going to be a terrible experience. They're going to get clipped right away. When you have somebody that knows how to play that game, it becomes a much more enjoyable experience. So if you actually had like a buddy program, or like this is Professor Chad, who's a 15-year-old, and his sister Zaina that play Roblox, and they're going to teach this 72-year-old couple how to play. I thought, man, that's a class I would love. I would love to see that. So many different ways to flip that.
Yeah.
I love the idea of just having a university where the professors are teenagers and they have the opportunity to teach things that they know. Like just teaching language, I think would be very funny as well. To have a Duolingo, but for 15-year-old based kids would be hilarious.
Yeah.
And maybe you could have, because every generation has lingo. So like you could have one for millennials and one for Gen Z, and I guess eventually
you can go all the way back to Shakespeare, right? You could go back to Old English and then take it all the way up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the whole exhibit. It's a university.
We've come up with some really dumb ideas.
Exactly. We've come up with some fun ideas, man.
Okay.
So I'm telling you, you all got to get dumber. That's it.
I love it.
We need to get prototyping. That's what we need to do.
That's right. That's the next step. Let's do it.
So, David, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And if you listen to podcasts, you know that Peter and I always wrap up with what we're taking away from today. So, as our guest, you get to go first. What's one thing you're taking away?
I get to go with what I've learned today.
Yes.
I'm taking away that there's some sort of confirmation in that fool idea, because I feel like the mention of that has now happened to me twice in a couple of weeks. And that feels like there's something very confirming in that. The second thing that I've learned, though, as well, is that I need to put more agency behind the idea of either visiting or moving to New Zealand. Because every time I have a conversation with somebody from New Zealand, it's always just amazing. So that's a big takeaway from me.
We look forward to seeing you here soon, David.
I'm coming.
Look forward to that. We'll have
You
a
think I'm joking? I'm
live.
coming.
Maybe you need to come over and do a book launch over here, and we'll do a live episode.
Yeah, that's right. We can build a Dumbify University there. We can do the.
Oh yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Dumbify. I was going to say Dumbify conference or convention, but what would the opposite? There is unconvention, but
Oh, that's
the
funny. Yeah,
opposite.
the Dumbify In convention.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Peter, what are you taking
What's
away?
my takeaway? I know you. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can ask me what my takeaway. So much is really difficult to pull out one thing. I might choose a couple, and sometimes little phrases really catch my mind. I think from thought to thing, and I guess that sits alongside or within this idea of staying in the space longer. So I'm going to take that as a call to action from you, David. Is that in my practice, designing activities and spaces, environments, questions, thoughts that help people stay here for longer and keep those dumb ideas not up. I guess up until now, I've generally treated the dumb ideas as just their starting points for great ideas. But actually, as you've helped me see, there's value in keeping those dumb ideas themselves alive for a lot longer because they in themselves have value and may turn into the part of the solution or the solution itself. So that's what I'm taking away.
well done.
Nice, love it.
Well done.
So for me, this conversation has been very challenging for the intellectual part of my brain because I am an academic, I'm a researcher, I'm super nerdy. Yet that curious part of my brain is up there clapping. So what I'm taking away from this conversation are two questions. One, so I journal daily. So one of the questions I want to add to my journaling practice is, what's the dumbest thing I've done today? As a challenge to
Love
myself
that.
to
That's
incorporate
fantastic.
dumbness into my day to day. And then the other thing is, as I'm going through my work, asking myself, how can I be dumber in this situation?
What's the dumbest way that I could think about this solution? What's the dumbest way I could think about? I'd be so into learning from you how that went for you. It's like the challenges or successes that you get from that. I'd love to follow up.
Well, that sounds like an invitation for another episode later down the line. So your book is coming out in the Northern Hemisphere summer, David, is that right?
Yeah, in August it looks like. So that should be good. But as soon as I've got the galleys ready, I'll send them to you.
Awesome.
But yeah, look for that. And I guess obviously head to the newsletter and we can have fun there as well. Feel free to reach out.
Yes.
Cool.
So where can people find out more about your book? Is it through your newsletter?
Yeah, if you go to david-carson.com, that has everything on there from the newsletter to book. There's also like the 12 sort of like frameworks that I use for myself. I just outline them there like more like mental models more than anything. So just explain them a little bit more in detail. They're outside of the newsletter, but they're helpful tools. They're there as well.
Nice. So we'll put the link to your website in our show notes so that our listeners can come find you. Thanks, everyone. I think that does it for us today. Thanks, David, so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Always a great chat.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Dani.
Thank you.
See you next time, everyone.
See you next time. Bye.